Hi everyone, this is Francesca with Social Work Portal. In this video, I'll walk you through what you need to know about the HIPAA form for patients to release medical information. If you work in social work, case management, behavioral health, or any human services or medical setting, the HIPAA release of information form is something you're going to encounter often. This video covers what the HIPAA authorization form is, how it differs from a HIPAA consent form, required elements, when a release is and isn't required, the most common mistakes to avoid, and how HIPAA-compliant case management software can support all of this. Plus, at the end, I'll tell you how to get a free HIPAA release form template you can use. So let's start with some HIPAA basics. First, what is HIPAA? HIPAA stands for Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. It was enacted in 1996 and it set the national standard in the United States for protecting sensitive patient health information. A key concept is protected health information, or PHI. PHI is any individually identifiable information connected to a person's physical or mental health, their health care, or their payment for healthcare services. That covers a lot of ground, including diagnosis, therapy notes, billing records, medical lists, and anything else that could identify a person and link them to a health-related record. The HIPAA Release of Information form, which is also called the HIPAA Authorization form, is the mechanism that gives a covered entity legal permission to share a client's PHI outside of their routine treatment purposes. And here's the key thing to understand about this form. It's not a blanket permission slip. Every valid authorization specifies exactly what information is being shared, with whom, for what purposes, and for how long. So who must comply with HIPAA? Well, if you're working in social work, case management, behavioral health, medical social services, or most nonprofit human services settings, HIPAA applies either to you directly or through a business associate agreement with a covered entity. Next, let's get into a distinction that often trips people up. A HIPAA consent form and a HIPAA authorization or release form are not the same thing. Using the wrong one in a given situation could be a compliance problem. A consent form is the routine stuff, using a client's health information for their treatment within your organization, for billing, and for standard operational purposes. Now, within your organization is the key point. You typically collect the HIPAA consent form at intake. It's broad by design, and it doesn't need to spell out exactly who will see the information or for what specific purpose. Most agencies have a standard consent form built into their intake packet. Now, an authorization form, also known as a release form, is a completely different form. It's required anytime that you want to share the PHI or protected health information outside of those routine treatment and operational purposes. That means sharing records with an outside agency or third party. Disclosing information to a family member who isn't directly involved in care is an example. Another example is releasing records for a legal proceeding or sharing information with an employer. Every one of those situations requires a separate, specific, signed authorization form. For social workers and case managers, the authorization form or release form is the one that you'll encounter consistently in daily practice, especially when you're doing referrals. So this is the form we're really focused on for the rest of the video, the HIPAA Release of Information form, also known as the HIPAA Authorization form, when you are sharing confidential patient health information with an outside entity. Now let's get into the required elements, because this is where a lot of real-world compliance problems can happen. The HIPAA privacy rule is enforced by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and it specifies 6 core elements that every valid HIPAA authorization form must contain. If any one of these is missing, the form is not compliant. The 6 required elements are a specific description of the information to be disclosed, the name or identification of the person or organization authorized to disclose the information, the name or identification of the person or organization who is receiving the information, the description of each purpose of the requested disclosure, an expiration date or an expiration event for the authorization, the signature of the individual, meaning the patient or client, and the date they signed. Now, on top of these 6 things, there are 3 additional things you want to consider. The patient needs to know that they have a right to revoke the authorization at any time in writing, and whether signing the form is a condition of receiving services, and whether the person or organization receiving the information might redisclose that to others. You'll want to use a standard template so everyone in your organization is covered. So let's see how this looks on an actual form. So here we are in the Case Management Hub platform, looking at the Authorization for Release of Health Information form. This is one of the many built-in templates. I'll select my client. Now let's check off some of those requirements for HIPAA compliance. Here we have the name or identification of the provider or entity that is releasing the information. Next is the name or identification of the third party who is receiving the information. Here we have the area where you can specify exactly what is being released. Now, one of the nice things about Case Management Hub is that you can easily come in and edit and update the fields however you'd like, such as adding your own option descriptions and enabling another field. You can also make fields required. Next, there's an optional from and to date to specify a specific range for the records to be released. And here we see the purpose or reason for the release of information. And this is another field where you can customize your options. Next, we have the required expiration date or event, and the required signature and date of signature. So getting the form right legally is only half the job. The other half is making sure your client actually understands what they're signing. This is both an ethical obligation and a practical one. A client who doesn't understand the form they're signing is more likely to feel coerced, more likely to revoke it later, and less likely to engage with the services the authorization is meant to enable. 3 practices help this go smoothly. First, use plain language throughout the form. Most clients have no idea what covered entity or protected health information means. Walk through the form in everyday terms. Here's the information we'd be sharing. Here's who would receive it. Here's what it would be used for. And here's when this permission expires. Second, make their control really clear. A lot of clients don't realize they can limit the scope of an authorization. They can set a specific expiration or revoke it entirely in writing at any time. That sense of agency often makes clients more willing to sign. And third, document the conversation in your case notes. Note that the client was informed, that they understood, and that authorization was given voluntarily. That documentation protects both you and the client. So let's take a look at a quick case study example that shows the process working well. Elena, who is a case manager, was helping a client transition from inpatient psychiatric care. Records needed to be shared with 3 outpatient providers and a housing program. Instead of handing over all 4 forms at once, she walked through each one individually with her client. The client ended up revoking one of them after understanding what would be shared. This is the process working exactly as HIPAA intended. The client has agency, and the case manager has coverage, knowing that their client is fully understanding what they're sharing. Now, not every disclosure of client information requires a signed authorization form, and knowing the difference keeps your workflow moving without unnecessary delays, while still protecting client privacy. Now, the disclosures that generally do not require authorization or a release of information form include sharing information among members of the treatment team for direct care purposes, mandatory reporting obligations such as child abuse or neglect, disclosures required by a court order, and certain public health reporting requirements. These are situations where the law either permits or requires disclosure without client authorization. The disclosures that do require a signed authorization form include releasing records to attorneys or employers, sharing information with family members who are not directly involved in care, disclosing psychotherapy notes, using information for marketing purposes, and sharing records with outside agencies unless a formal data sharing agreement is already in place. The psychotherapy notes rule is worth highlighting, specifically for social workers and clinicians. Under HIPAA, psychotherapy notes get a higher level of protection than general health records. Many of the standard permitted disclosures that apply to general health information do not apply to psychotherapy notes. Look up the HIPAA guideline for more information. So now let's get into some of the common HIPAA release form mistakes and how to avoid them. Even experienced practitioners make avoidable errors with HIPAA release forms. So let's run through the 5 most common ones. First, using an outdated or incomplete form. HIPAA requirements do get updated, and forms that were valid several years ago may be missing elements that are now required. Make it a practice to review your forms against current HHS guidelines at least annually. Second, accepting an expired authorization. If a client signed a form that has already passed its expiration date, that form is no longer valid. Releasing information based on an expired authorization is a HIPAA violation. Third, releasing more information than was specifically authorized. If the form covers intake records from a specific date range, you cannot release the full case file. The scope of the disclosure must match the scope of the authorization exactly. Fourth, failing to document the disclosure. The signed authorization form needs to be stored securely in the client record. and the disclosure itself should be logged, including what was shared, with whom, and when. Fifth, and this one is really important, pressuring a client to sign. HIPAA is explicit that authorization must be voluntary. Any indication of pressure or coercion can invalidate the form. The client has to feel free to say no when being asked to share their personal health information. Congratulations on making it through the end. You now hopefully have a better understanding of the HIPAA release form for patients and how to use it. Now, where can you download a free release form template? Just click the link in the video description to sign up for a free 21-day trial of a HIPAA-compliant case management system. Once you've signed up, go to Forms and Client Forms and enter Release in the search box. You can download the form and keep it, even if you don't sign up. Oh, and did I mention you don't need a credit card to start a free trial? Thanks so much for hanging with me and watching my video. If you like this type of content and want to learn more about social services and nonprofit tools and resources, like this video and subscribe to our channel. You'll never miss one of our new exciting videos.